Hey Burns, what's happening?
Rick, I'm a little under the weather. As we 74-year-olds like to do, I took a bad fall on Tuesday, and I feel like I've been in an auto wreck. So if our listeners think, boy, he's off today, that's why. But I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm just by way of explanation saying I don't feel like myself. But
Well,
politically, I'm myself.
well, that's what I was going to say because you look okay.
Well, thank you for that.
Well, I like the way you've got your hands set.
My what?
Your hands, where you put them together and put them under your chin.
Well, I was going to do that to keep my head up because the back of my neck hurts from the fall. But I've also developed another set of bruises on my hands, so I'm self-conscious about that. As you all know, there's always something, right?
Yeah.
You're the guy who advised me that getting old isn't for wimps, and a truer statement's never been made.
No, that's true.
So anyways, I'd like to open our podcast, this podcast 34, right?
Yes.
I'd like to open it today, talk a little bit about inflation. I'm sure we'll segue to the Ukraine. But interestingly enough, or maybe not so surprising, in a recent poll, Americans are infinitely more concerned about the inflation rate in the country than they are about the war in the Ukraine. In fact, right now, it's listed as the top concern. So I've done a little research on that, trying to ferret out why that would be. And among the interesting statistics I found, Dick, is that 67% of American families live paycheck to paycheck. And in living paycheck to paycheck, literally have no ability to save any money. They don't even have money set aside for the occasional, crisis that happens to all families. The refrigerator goes out, or the washing machine won't work, or the car needs a,
Yeah, but that's Putin's fault.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. I hear you. The other thing I found interesting, another statistic, and by the way, these aren't, 2-year-old websites I found, that this stuff is current as of March 2022, is that even families where a single breadwinner or both spouses work and they make in excess of $120,000 a year, half of those people live paycheck to paycheck. Then lastly, I read that when asked, most families, the majority, said that if there was an income level that they felt they would be able to cover their expenses and salt away a little bit of savings, $120,000 annually in income is the number most often quoted. And that just happens to be double what the average American family makes in income. So in other words, average income for an American family, as we speak, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000. And the average American family feels they need $120,000 to make ends meet.
Well, you and I talked about that a while back, and I told you that anything below $90,000 a year in Hawaii is below the poverty level, which I
Right.
find absolutely unbelievable. And the same thing showed up. In order to live, be able to pay rent and buy food for a family of four, you had to have $120,000 a year. Hell, I remember when I was earning $213 a month.
Well, which all goes to say the reason I'm bringing this up is the Democrats, true to their preoccupation with the left's radical agenda, are absolutely tone deaf and so out of touch with Americans that it's beyond comprehension. And they spend. I mean, every day you read a headline about what they're doing for illegal aliens. And
Yeah, but that's the government spending. I mean, it's government money.
well, according to Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, two of my favorite people, they expressed outrage this week, that they and the Democratic Party are being blamed for the inflation rate of 7.9%, as if they haven't been spending any money, when in point of fact, they've been spending trillions. And as an example, had Biden's boondoggle not been stopped dead in its tracks by Senator Manchin of West Virginia, they would have spent a couple more trillion just on that.
Do I get to talk about supply and demand economics?
Well, sure, jump in. Yeah, I'll rest.
Okay, rest your head. Yeah, what I've been pushing lately, and people haven't been paying too much attention. By the way, apparently, although we had posted our last podcast, some of our fans never saw it. So I went out individually and talked to them. Okay, simple economics. Supply and demand. Supply goes down, prices go up. Demand goes down, prices go down, and vice versa. And that's just the way it is. And, and you and I talked about this months ago, but the stimulus plans and everything raised raised demand, but did nothing for supply, i.e. production of goods, whatever.
Right.
And so what did we get? Inflation. When did it start? Right after Biden came in. Can we blame it on Putin now? Probably not a smart move. So how do we get inflation down? You got a couple of deals. You raise supply, which Biden has successfully canceled, or you drop demand. That's it. There's no other option.
Well, I think there's one other. Tell me if you agree or disagree. The Federal Reserve Board can get off its butt and raise interest rates.
Yeah, well, I was going to get into that because there are ways you can short circuit the system. The problem becomes, though, for the average American, unless you can cut down demand, every other day driving, no driving on Sundays, which I went through in 1973, There's nothing you can do. And so Biden's stimulus for COVID was one of the greatest impetus for inflation. The stopping of drilling, of course, lowered supply, raised prices. And I mean, and you know, I just heard on CNN or somewhere, I don't really like any of them, but you know, for the midterm elections, the big talk is going to be it's Biden's fault. I'm sorry, it's Putin's fault. And you know, it's just so simple. Having lived through it, God knows how many times, particularly when the market totally crashed, what, back in the 80s? You know, it's incredible how these people, you know, look at it and who they try to blame it on.
Well, they create huge problems. Perhaps never in our history, so many problems across the board in such a short space of time. And now that the midterms are coming up, they're trying to deflect all that. And Biden thought he could ride out a first term, 4 years, with blame it on Trump. And that hasn't worked. So now he's got Putin as the fall guy now. Putin's certainly the fall guy in the context of invading a country without provocation. But to begin laying all of our domestic problems at the feet of Vladimir Putin is ridiculous. But the Democrats do it unabashedly. You know, they just try to pass the buck. And gasoline prices, again, in the short space of 12 to 13 months, were up. This is a national average, not what it is on either of the coasts, but it was up over $1 a gallon from when Trump left office, before Putin ever invaded. So this notion that Putin, from whom we bought only about 3% of our fuel from, the notion that Putin has caused this is crazy. And what has Joe Biden done? He still has dug in his heels, and he's not gone back to Trump's energy independent policies that reached fruition in Trump's 4-year term. And we, in point of fact, were net exporters of fuel. And Biden campaigned. He talked about it in the debates. He doesn't want to hear now what he said, but he said, I'm going to stop fracking. I'm going to stop drilling on federal lands. We're going to stop drilling in the Arctic. We're going to stop drilling offshore, and on it went.
Okay.
It's just incredible. And what is the answer quickly of the Biden administration? Go out and buy electric cars. And Cackling Harris actually made a public statement about take the electric powered bus. I mean, do you think the average worker hears that? And I hearken back to those statistics I cited. They can't go out and, do a major repair on their automobile, let alone buy an expensive battery operated car. But the administration is tone deaf.
What the average American needs to realize is that the electricity is basically fossil fuel run.
Yeah.
And so basically your electric car is burning oil. instead of burning gas. That's issue number one. Issue number two, and I hope I don't lose this thought in a senior moment, is if you really don't like fossil fuel, I challenge you to turn off the gas to your house. I mean, unless you're a real hypocrite, that's what you got to do. What say you?
Well, I'll say this. Two things. Jesse Waters on Fox News has begun showcasing Democratic congressmen who have been strong proponents of the Green New Deal, but who weeks and months in advance of Putin's invasion of the Ukraine began investing heavily in oil stocks, energy stocks. And this isn't, like a one-off situation. It's not one senator or one member of the House of Representatives. I mean, to me, it's scandalous. Number two, having, among other things, been an executive in the bulk trucking industry, I came to learn very quickly that there's a vast array of products that most Americans are completely unaware of, and apparently our federal government is, that in some way, shape, or form use the byproducts of fossil fuels in their manufacture. And if you literally could stop fossil fuel development tomorrow, we'd be in a deep hurt on a number of products, not simply fuel for our cars and trucks. I mean, what I'm saying is people don't get it.
Well, yeah, and I just saw something this morning, and I'm not sure exactly the figures, but only a third of a barrel, which is 42 gallons. When I grew up, a barrel was 55 gallons, so I don't know what happened. But only like 30% goes into making fuel, diesel, gas, whatever. The rest goes into other products. For example, one of the medicines that I use, it's petroleum based. Whoops, let's see. There it is. Well, whatever. And
cosmetics.
Yeah, well, cosmetics, medicine, everything.
Right.
Plastic. Even plastic is made out of the leftover, what, 70%?
Yeah, but nonetheless, you have the AOCs of the world railing against fossil fuels, and without any knowledge whatsoever of all the things, many of them vital to our way of life, that fossil fuels are used in the manufacture development of.
Yeah, well, the sad part is the average American doesn't have a clue. And I don't know how you educate them because they don't want to listen. I mean, who was it who said, hey, it's economic stupid? Was that Bush 1? I'm not sure. And so that's all people care about, their own pocketbook. I got something here that I picked up, and I think I sent it to you. Instead of complaining about gas prices going up, try feeling grateful that you aren't sitting on a concrete floor in a train station holding your cat, wondering if your home and everyone you love has been blown to bits.
Yeah.
And I don't think the average American gets that. Here's another one. Yes, gas prices are high. We can choose to travel less. We can choose to carpool. We can choose to bicycle. We can choose to walk. We can choose public transportation. Ukraine can't. And there, but for the grace of God, go we. if people got into that and really understood it, we might make some progress. But I don't think they'll ever get the plan. And Pelosi and Biden and the others, they'll never get it.
I'd be absolutely willing through the enactment of term limits to sacrifice some quality senators and members of the House of Representatives along the way so that we don't have to put up with crackpots until they're deep into their 80s. I've been reading and this isn't an endorsement yet, I'm still studying it, but a Republican senator has proposed an 11-point plan for the GOP's kind of a strategic plan for the future, which I find is a novel idea for the GOP. Believe me, I don't let them off the hook any more than I do the Democrats. And Mitch McConnell has jumped in and said, if the Senate wins back the GOP majority in the midterms, he's the one that's going to decide. I mean, it sounds like George Bush, I'm the decider. He said he'll decide what the Republican Party's agenda is. Well, we know how strategic Mitch McConnell is, and I'm just here to say he's another example. I mean, I think Schumer and Pelosi are infinitely more detrimental to the United States than Mitch McConnell. But in the context of the Republican Party, I think he's another guy that's been in office too long, or at least in a position of powerful leadership.
Well, I think you screwed that up because I don't look at any of them providing leadership. I mean,
Well,
that might be what their title is, but leaders lead, and you can't lead with your feet sitting on a desk. And unfortunately, that's what most of them do. They're more interested in being, quote, leaders than they are in actually leading.
yeah.
And back in former times, notice I didn't use the term olden days, but in former times, we had, even Hubert Humphrey, you'd argue, you'd fight and whatever, but, you'd ultimately come out with something. These guys have come out with nothing. Zero, zippo, nada.
Yeah, I remember old Hubert. And to his credit, while I didn't necessarily agree with many of his liberal ideas, I thought he was fair-minded and articulated his points of view and his agenda, and he had the courage of his convictions. And it seemed like back in the day there was counterpoint between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and there was a willingness to compromise, and things were less extreme. I saw on your Facebook page, Dick, excerpts of speeches by Bill Clinton and Barack Obama on illegal immigration and the problem it was to the United States in what each intended to do to correct everything from border security to uh, deportations uh, and so forth. And it was I'd almost use the word, at the risk of hyperbole, is that was chilling, because it suggested in the space of a very short time in terms of US presidential history that the Democratic Party truly has become a captive of these extreme left-wing radicals, these Marxists, that have the Democratic Party doing its bidding, including Joe Biden, who used to be labeled a moderate. Now, I think Joe Biden was labeled a moderate because he never accomplished anything in his 47-year Senate career. But he was labeled a moderate, and he ran on that against Trump. And people who had issues with Trump, and particularly his tweets, thought, well, maybe Biden can reunite us, good old Uncle Joe. Well, hell, Uncle Joe has been an absolute radical. Now, I think he sits down in the Oval Office, and who's ever pulling the strings are handing him all the executive orders to rescind everything Trump did, much of which was good for the country. If you get past the noise level of Donald Trump, the policies he put in place turned out to be quite good. And now we're paying the price. 81 million voters who voted for mentally challenged Joe Biden and the hackling Kamala Harris have really put the screws to this country. And I'm sorry, but I hold them accountable too. You have to be an informed voter. You have to do your homework. And as you like to talk about, Dick, you have to be a critical thinker. And I think so many of them just go into the ballot box and they're like Pavlovian's dog. They pull the lever for the Democratic Party time after time after time.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think you're right. And the more we talk, the more righter I think you've become. And it's just absolutely unbelievable. I mean, oh, what would, yeah, but you get the weirdos. You sent me an article about Hawaii, wanting insurance companies to pay for sex change and you name it. And I thought, well, I'm not really going to go for that. But today, Governor DeSantis is now doing some really weird stuff, I think, where it's child abuse if you support a transgender child. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I mean, they're all weird. They're all suffering terminal weirdism.
That is not my understanding. Now, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying that's not my understanding. My understanding is the law passed in Florida that the left has reacted to is that it can't be part of the curriculum for kindergartners through, I think, third grade. Could be wrong about that, but
no, that's what I understand.
Youngest students to be taught sex education, transgenderism, and some of the other things that most of us learned in locker rooms when we were in our late teens. I regard that as beyond the pale. So that's my understanding.
No, and that's fair understanding. It's just that, I'm one of these guys that thinks school boards ought to be able to determine what's taught. And to have a governor get involved or even the state or whatever, I just don't like it, you know? I agree with everything you said. It's pathetic. What, we didn't have sex education until what, the ninth grade, I guess? You obviously did quite well.
I have a response, but I'm not going to say it. Discretion is the better part of valor.
Okay, well, I'll withdraw it then, but
No, but my mom tossed a book to me. She was too embarrassed to talk about it. My dad didn't talk about it. Yeah, I got this silly book. And by the way, it's funny. I've been married 54 years, and I never recall my wife mentioning this, but she told me she never had the quote unquote talk from either of her parents, but they did give her a book kind of remotely on sex education. And who do you think the author was? Pat Boone.
oh, God.
That breaks me up.
No, I figured it was going to be Dr. Spock or something.
Hey, listen, lest I forget, you and I had a private conversation yesterday. I kind of crapped out yesterday on doing a podcast and said, let's see if we could do it today. But you made a terrific point, and I'd like you to bring it up and amplify it. And it had to do with all of the ramp up time that the United States had in observing Putin steadily increase the number of troops on the northern and eastern border of the Ukraine. And we're talking months. And that most of the response from Joe Biden in terms of armaments and money has been after 2 weeks of the Ukraine being reduced to rubble. And I won't say any more because you said it so well yesterday.
Well, yeah, whether or not it was a training exercise the Russians were doing or anything else, we could have turned it into a training exercise from a NATO point of view. I'm a real fan, even though people are now kind of talking it down, but I'm an A-10, Warthog fan. You send out an A-10 and you can knock out tanks as fast as whatever. What I would have done, and I have been to general staff school, so I have a kind of a grip on this, but what I would have done as soon as the buildup started, on the other side, I would have brought in Warthogs. I would have brought in all this stuff. And, if nothing happened, then you send the stuff all home. But to wait until hostilities, is absolutely incredible. Now, you're not going to like this, and I wasn't going to say it, but I will. The latest threat from Putin is, I'm going to start targeting the aid going into Ukraine because it's war materials. And, quite frankly, that's kind of a valid argument. On the other hand, if he screws up and goes over into like Poland or something by a misfired shot or something else, as far as I'm concerned, that's grounds to friggin' level their army. And we do have the ability to do that, particularly since, as I've said now for several months, their tactics suck. I mean, they still have the old siege mentality, hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces going back to World War II. And they're easy to take out. All it would take is a misstep. And since a lot of damage has already been done, I kind of hope that Putin does make a misstep. But on the other hand, I hope that NATO and EU, because I think it's really an EU problem, not a NATO problem, it'd be a great excuse to just totally, wipe them out.
Well, I read an article today on the unprovoked war on Chechnya that Yeltsin began when he led Russia. I guess that was mid-90s. And then
What, a war where?
in Chechnya,
Oh, Chechnya, yes.
yeah. And eventually Russia withdrew, but after pretty well devastating what actually was a Soviet-controlled, I'm going to use the word province, but I may be wrong in using that word. And I believe it was largely a Muslim population. But then when he handed off the mantle of leadership to, at the time, a relatively unknown guy named Vladimir Putin, Putin almost immediately in the late 90s went right back into Chechnya and laid waste to the place. And so,
unfortunately, that's what he's doing to Ukraine. So no matter what happens, the Ukraine is going to be wiped out. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, the Russians have no concept of combat in the cities. And the Ukrainians can stretch this out for years, absolute years. And you can't occupy anything unless you put boots on the ground. And the Russians don't have enough boots on the ground to do that. So, it's ultimately going to work out to my satisfaction, but the pain is going to be absolutely disgusting. And then the question comes up, and my wife has mentioned it. Well, you can't blame the Russian people. Well, if they decide this guy was a fucking nutcase and they decided to get rid of him, I would agree with it. But on the other hand, if they sit back and play, well, I don't know what's going on, and I support this, and yeah, it's a limited operation, you got to blame them. It's like the Nazis in World War II. Who do you blame? The generals, the subordinates, or the people that put up with it?
fair point. I mean, at least to the credit of most Americans now, not when they voted in the last election, but all of the major polls show right now that almost across the board, people are fed up with the Biden administration. Now, I'm not saying that liberals are standing on street corners thumping their chests and saying I made a mistake, but and I'm not saying that a vast majority of those 81 million would turn back to Trump now, and in doing so betray the error of their ways. But I damn sure see in the numbers that a lot of people have had a cold splash of water and thought, my God, what have we got here? And it's not just confined to his policies, but also to his apparent addled state, lack of mental acuity. I mean, I know I talk about this quite often, but I don't know, because we don't get good news out of Russia. But to your point, and I think it's well taken, is are the Russian people embarrassed and appalled by what is happening to to the Ukraine, are they buying into this notion that it's a war of liberation, which absolutely makes no sense. But, you know, if you hear the same tune every day through the state-controlled media, I don't know how many people there are free thinkers, but
Well, thousands of demonstrators, I look at it as three groups of people. First of all, there have been thousands of demonstrators arrested. Some people did get the word. I've seen other things on CNN where they've interviewed Russians who totally support Putin. And why do they support him? Because it's to their advantage. It's just like the Americans that worry about the price of gas. Russians worry about the price of this, that, and everything else. And then there's a third group that just thinks Russia is going down the wrong path. And the question becomes, is who wins? As I understand it, Putin surrounds himself with an FSB guard that'll literally do anything to protect him. You see, he sits at long tables, so he doesn't have to be close to anybody. Like when Langendorf blew up, Hitler's conference room. So, what happens? I don't know. But if the Russian, the issue is, how can I say this? The issue is not so much Putin, but it's a society that allows a Putin to emerge.
right.
If it weren't for them, he never would have been here. Unless he pulled a 1920s whatever. But, so I don't think the Russian people can be excused. I don't feel sorry for them at all. None. Zippo, zero. If they can't get their McDonald's burger, tough luck. Now they're talking about confiscating all the Western infrastructure that's been abandoned. Well, great. Have fun. Try to set up your own McDonald's somewhere. It reminds me when I used to go to East Berlin, and the family went to lunch, and they handed us a menu. Of course, we had to wait 20 minutes to get a menu, and we were the only people in the place. But we ordered such and such. 20 minutes later, waitress came back, said, we're out. Anyways, this went on maybe a half a dozen times. So we finally ended up getting a hot dog with ketchup. Well, first of all, I don't eat hot dogs with ketchup. I eat it with mustard. But I mean, that's what they've been reduced to. Total lack of motivation, total lack of initiative, total lack of anything other than the fact that they had a free government job. And, if they're going to sit back and allow this to happen, when there are a lot of people that obviously know it's wrong, then, they don't have my sympathy. I'm really sorry. Ukraine, on the other hand, has my sympathy, and what's going on is absolutely criminal. But it's becoming a repeat of Operation Barbarossa by Adolf Hitler. It's an exact repeat. The only difference being Hitler came from the West and Putin's coming from the East.
Well, to that point, if you look at what Putin did in Chechnya and what he did in Crimea and what he did in Georgia and what he's doing now in the Ukraine, and his anything but tacit threats to certain NATO countries, this thing may not stop. It may be some kind of juggernaut unless NATO stiffens its spine. And as you said, Europe takes a stand.
Well, I think NATO is getting its duckies together, but I still view it as an EU issue. It's very Europe, and although it's admirable what we've done to some extent, uh, they have to take care of their own neighborhood.
So,
And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, but then you're going to have a world war. Well, you could have a world war anyway.
but this, so our listeners know, if you didn't listen to podcast 33, the one that preceded this one, that's a pretty comprehensive discussion, an exclusive discussion of the Ukraine. We've had some people complain it's much too long a podcast, but you were worked up on the subject. I was worked up on the subject. And I think for, just a couple of retirees watching the landscape of international affairs, I think we did credit to, a layman's analysis of Ukraine. So anybody who's keen on understanding it a little better and wants to get something other than the jaded legacy news media, look up our podcast 33 on YouTube.
Well, I wanted to add one other thing, and it worries me more than anything else. And that's the possibility that Russia is preparing a false flag nuclear chemical attack. Absolutely disgusting. But if that's the only way he can get people living in their basements and stuff and wipe them out, again, reading from the Russian playbook, and we've got one, this is how we fight wars. They've got it, and they have no problem.
Well, Dick, explain for our listeners what a false flag operation is.
Okay, a false flag operation, and the greatest example is the current chemical thing. What you do is you tell everybody that your enemy is going to use something or is developing chemical weapons and whatever. And so what you'll do ultimately is you'll use that as an excuse to be first use. See, the United States in nuclear weapons refuses, well, what's our policy? I think it's called denial of first use. We're not going to use it first. We'll use it after. And I have no problem with that. As a matter of fact, it's probably got some benefits. But if you do set up a false flag operation, you can go in and say, well, we did it because they were going to do it. And so we become the enemy. It's our fault, kind of like blame Putin.
Right.
And he can pretty much do what he wants. Now, I thought when I was working at the USD mill facility at Johnston Atoll, I thought some of the weapons that we were destroying were Russian. I thought the Russians had pretty much followed us by getting rid of chemical weapons. Apparently, that's not the case. And having been exposed to mustard as a minimum, it's got awful. I mean, it's terrible. And how do we defend against it now? We can't send CBR gear to Ukraine now. It's a little late. Again, if we had prepared ahead of time, we could have. But I just don't understand. If you work at the Pentagon, and I'm not going to point fingers, but if you work at the Pentagon and you got the playbook in your hand, you would go through the playbook and you would come up with contingency plans to handle everything. Well, the Biden administration didn't do that. In other words, we're a day late and $1 short.
I think
You know, the other thing that really gets me, and I have yet to figure this out, is why did the Russians allow us to continue to resupply Ukraine for the last 3 weeks? I mean, they could have shut off the transport routes, but they didn't. I mean, they're just not making sense.
Well, they're taking heavy casualties if the reports are accurate. It's pretty impressive what the people of the Ukraine are accomplishing.
Well, yeah, it is, and they are doing a good job. The problem is, remember, we started with 100,000 troops against a lot smaller country. I'm sure you watched Kamala Harris explain, you know, the big country takes the little country, blah, blah, blah. By the way, I got that quote off Fox News and I'll send it to you.
Kamala Harris reminds me of third grade show and tell.
Yeah.
I mean, her remarks, to say they're simplistic is understatement.
Well, her statements in Poland and the other areas that she went to visit were even more bizarre.
And you know, I think it goes without saying that if you're talking on a very serious subject, you don't cackle in between simplistic declarative sentences. Russia is a big country. Ukraine is a small country. Ukraine and Russia's borders touch one another. There is a war in the Ukraine. I mean, good God. This is a person who could assume the presidency?
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about how 81 million people boxed us in. I mean, if, you know, Joe Biden were to die in office, be impeached, whatever the case may be, and Kamala is the answer to that. And then, of course, in succession after Kamala would be Nancy Pelosi. What has this country done to itself? Jeez.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
But anyways, I think your point on many things we could have done as we watched this build up. You know, we have satellite imagery that shows the built up over days, weeks, and months. We have, you know, intelligence forces. We just seem to be asleep at the wheel.
Well,
And
that's kind of the way that I look at it.
yeah. And when you look at that and make that assessment, and then look at all the other issues, it's incredible just how bad this administration is. It really is. But I do feel for the people in the Ukraine, particularly the children and women. And I do believe, accept that Putin is a war criminal, and that the attacks on civilian populations is purposeful, just based on the numbers.
Yeah, but see, but there's a problem with that, in that Russia and the United States did not sign the Hague Criminal Court, whatever it was called. And so even if he gets grabbed, you know, aside from doing a Nuremberg thing, there's not a hell of a lot you can do.
Yeah, a lot of it's just kind of saber rattling.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and the Russians have always had this approach to warfare. And so to them, what's the difference between Ukraine, Crimea, Georgia, etc.? It's just the way it is.
One,
And that's what's pathetic, to even make a comment that that's the way it is. It's pathetic. It's unbelievable.
it's just interesting if you look at history, the Russians were our allies in World War II. And among the allied nations, they far and away took the heaviest toll and loss of life. And that may be a statement in itself about how they value life.
But I was talking about that with my wife this morning, and you would think that after World War II, we would have been the greatest of buddies. But then Stalin came along and everything went to hell in a handcart, and it got worse as time went on.
Yeah, I guess George Patton was right.
I think he was totally right.
Yeah.
But the Russian people have suffered for so long. It's pathetic. I mean, it's absolutely pathetic. But that's the way it is. But there again, that's why I go back to my comment that Europe has to take care of itself.
I remember in my younger years, you likely do too, Khrushchev was always trying to get their agricultural program off the ground, so to speak. And he had 5-year plan after 5-year plan after 5-year plan, and they just couldn't meet the needs of their people. Yep. I used to jokingly say that they couldn't figure out how to grow rutabagas. But
well, you know what's interesting, and I was not aware of this. Ukraine grows what, 30% of the wheat in the world?
Yeah, I wasn't aware either.
And so what's happened is the Russians have succeeded in eliminating, and my wife brought this up, they've succeeded in eliminating their food source.
And they're a major exporter of barley.
Throughout the world.
Exactly, and what I'm reading is we're going to see beer prices. They can climb now. That won't affect you because you drink Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah, but what you're going to see, and we've got 2 more minutes, is you're going to see famine in Russia, regardless of what happens. Even if we stop with the economic sanctions and stuff that have been put in place, the Russians will have no source of supply. Bread lines, on and on and on. So, once again, whatever their tactical plan was, they just screwed up big time.
Well, if there's somebody who has been eyeing Putin's place in the Kremlin, this should be a golden opportunity to make a move.
Yeah, but because but you look at the analysis of who could make a move, and there are people that are just as nasty as him.
Yeah, it could be.
So
I'll make one quick comment here to close me out, and then you can finish. I hope it's not lost on the young people, and by young people, I'm talking about, I guess, the millennials. But this infatuation with Bernie Sanders and socialism, I'll call it socialism / communism. I hope they're taking note of these yachts that various Western democracies are confiscating from the Russian oligarchs as a response to the war in the Ukraine. I mean, these things look 2 blocks long.
Oh, yeah.
This notion that in a country like Russia, or a country like Venezuela, or a country like Cuba, or Korea, or China, that the small groups of elites that control the country under the veil of the communist philosophy, they live better than capitalists do.
Yeah, well, the only good news is Jeff Bezos is building a yacht and it's going to be bigger than any of the ones.
Yeah, he's got to have a bridge taken down to get the thing out to sea.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's kind of interesting. Oh, what I wanted to say in closing, getting back to gasoline and getting back to economics, is people, and getting back to wheat for that matter, these are commodities. The price is determined on the world market. Again, supply goes down, price goes up. Demand goes up, price goes up. And once you realize that, you really have to take a look at what you want to affect and change, and you want to do it where it's effective. You know, cutting out our 3% import of Russian oil, that's as dumb as dumb. I mean, that's dumber than dumb.
Well, it's dumb in the context, Dick. I'm just going to amplify your statement of turning to the Saudis, Venezuela. Who am I leaving out?
Iran, Iraq.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. You know, we're just trading off one set of son of a bitches for another set. In terms of
Exactly, which is why you have to do a cost benefit analysis, which I don't think anybody in the administration has done, and determine if the cost is worth the gain. And
I think what we need to do is, if an executive order reversed, not congressional legislation, but an executive order from Joe Biden reversed all of Trump's policies that led to energy independence, then for God's sakes, admit your mistake and reverse everything back to where it was when you took office. Why make the nation suffer because you made a horrendous miscue, Joe Biden?
Yeah, well, you know, interesting. In former times, and I haven't looked at it lately, Hawaii used to get its oil from Indonesia. You know, since oil is a commodity, there are all kinds of places that have it. And we need to be really careful where we decide to get it.
Right.
And we have to look at cost benefit. What's the cost? What's the benefit? You know, if we decide to buy our oil from Indonesia, for example, and they obviously don't have enough, but if we do, you know, a situation like that, that could be real benefits for our popularity in the East. Right now, I think most of it's going to China. So, you know, you have to play that into it. Okay, I think we've done it. I'm frustrated. You're frustrated. I guess I'll see you next week.
Yeah, time to take a nap.
Yep, that's what I'm going to do.